Holmes had read carefully a note which the last post had brought him. Then, with the dry chuckle which was his nearest approach to a laugh, he tossed it over to me.
For a mixture of the modern and the medieval, of the practical and of the wildly fanciful, I think this is surely the limit,
said he.
What do you make of it, Watson?
I read as follows: 46 Old DJOR Nov 19 Vampires. SR, our client Mr. Robert Ferguson has made some inquiry. As our firm specializes entirely upon the assessment of machinery, the matter hardly comes within our purview. We have therefore recommended Mr. Ferguson to call upon you. We have not forgotten your successful action in the case of Matilda Briggs.
Matilda Briggs was not the name of a young woman, Watson,
said Holmes in a reminiscent voice.
It was a ship, which is associated with the giant rat of Sumatra, a story for which the world is not yet prepared. But what do we know about vampires? Does it come within our purview either? Make a long arm, Watson, and see what V has to say.
I leaned back and took down the great index volume to which he referred. Holmes balanced it on his knee.
Voyage of the Gloria Scott.
He read.
Victor Lynch the Forger. Venomous Lizard or Gila. Remarkable case, that! Hello, good old index. You can't beat it. Listen to this, Watson. Vampirism in Hungary. And again, vampires in Transylvania.
He turned over the pages with eagerness, but after a short intent perusal he threw down the great book with a snarl of disappointment.
Rubbish, Watson, rubbish! What have we to do with walking corpses who can only be held in their grave by stakes driven through their hearts? It's pure lunacy.
Surely,
said I.
The vampire was not necessarily a dead man. A living person might have the habit.
You are right, Watson. No ghosts need apply. I fear that we cannot take Mr. Robert Ferguson very seriously.
He took up a second letter. This he began to read with a smile of amusement which gradually faded away into an expression of intense interest.
Cheeseman's Lamberley. Where is Lamberley, Watson?
It is in Sussex, south of Horsham. I know that country, Holmes. It is full of old houses named after the men who built them centuries ago.
Said Holmes coldly.
The letter is from Robert Ferguson. By the way, he claims acquaintance with you.
He handed the letter across. It was headed with the address quoted.
Dear Marhamas, I have been recommended to you by my lawyers, but indeed the matter is so extraordinarily delicate that it is most difficult to discuss. It concerns a friend for whom I am acting. This gentleman married some 5 years ago a Peruvian lady, the daughter of a Peruvian merchant, whom he had met in connection with the importation of nitrates. The lady was very beautiful, but the fact of her foreign birth and of her alien religion always caused a separation of interests and of feelings between husband and wife. The gentleman had been married twice and he had one son by the first wife. This boy was now 15, a very charming and affectionate youth, though unhappily injured through an accident in childhood. Twice the wife was caught in the act of assaulting this poor lad in the most unprovoked way. Once she struck him with a stick and left a great weal on his arm. This was a small matter, however, compared with her condud child, a dear boy just under 1 year of age. As the nurse ran into the room she saw her employer, the lady, leaning over the baby and apparently biting his neck. There was a small wound in the neck, from which a stream of blood had escaped. The nurse was so horrified that the lady implored her not to do so, and actually gave her £5 as a price for her silence. Day and night the nurse covered the child, and day and night the silent, watchful mother seemed to be lying in wait as a wolf waits for a lamb. Nurse and master rushed together to the nursery. Imagine his feelings, Mr. Holmes, as he saw his wife rise from a kneeling position beside the cot. With a cry of horror, he turned his wife's face to the light and saw blood all round her lips. It was she beyond all question, who had drunk the poor baby's blood. Will you see me? If so, kindly wire to Ferguson, Cheeseman's Lamberley. P.S. I believe your friend Watson played rugby for Blackheath when I was 3/4 for Richmond. Of course I remember him,
said I as I laid down the letter.
Big Bob Ferguson, the finest 3/4 Richmond ever had. He was always a good-natured chap.
I never get your limits, Watson,
said he.
There are unexplored possibilities about you. Take a wire down like a good fellow. We'll examine your case with pleasure. We must not let him think that this agency is a home for the weak-minded. Of course it is his case.
Promptly at 10 o'clock next morning Ferguson strode into our room. I had remembered him as a long, slab-sided man with a fine turn of speed. His great frame had fallen and his flaxen hair was scanty, and his shoulders were bowed.
"Hello, Watson,"
said he.
"I see by your telegram, Mr. Holmes, that it is no use my pretending to be anyone's deputy."
It is simpler to deal direct,
said.
"How am I to go to the police with such a story? And yet the kiddies have got to be protected. Is it madness, Mr. Holmes? For God's sake, give me some advice."
Very naturally, Mr. Ferguson. I am confident we shall find some solution. First of all, tell me what steps you have taken. Is your wife still near the children?
We had a dreadful scene. She gave no answer to my reproaches, save to gaze at me with a sort of wild, despairing look in her eyes. Then she rushed to her room and locked herself in. Since then she has refused to see me. She has a maid who was with her before her marriage, Dolores by name, a friend rather than a servant. She takes her food to her.
Then the child is in no immediate danger.
Mrs. Mason, the nurse, has sworn that she will not leave at night or day. I can absolutely trust her. I am more uneasy about poor little Jack, for, as I told you in my note, he has twice been assaulted by her.
But never wounded.
No, she struck him savagely. A fall in childhood and a twisted spine, Mr. Holmes. But the dearest, most loving heart within.
Ferguson's gaunt features softened as he spoke of his boy. Holmes had picked up the letter of yesterday and was reading it over.
What other inmates are there in your house, Mr. Ferguson?
2 servants, 1 stable hand, Michael, who sleeps in the house. My wife, myself, my boy Jack, baby, Dolores, and Mrs. Mason. That is all.
Then your wife's character would really be better known by Dolores than by you.
Yes, you may say so.
Holmes made a note.
I fancy that I may be of more use at Lamberley than here. It is eminently a case for personal investigation.
Ferguson gave a gesture of relief.
It is what I hoped, Mr. Holmes. There is an excellent train at 2 from Victoria if you could come.
Of course we could come. There is a lull at present. Watson, of course, comes with us. But there are 1 or 2 points upon which I wish to be very sure. This unhappy lady has appeared to assault both the children, her own baby and your little son. But the assaults take different forms, do they not? She has beaten your son.
Once with a stick and once very savagely with her hands. She gave no explanation why she struck him, none, save that she hated him.
Well, that is not unknown among stepmothers. A posthumous jealousy, we will say. Is the lady jealous by nature?
Yes, she is very jealous, jealous with all the strength of her fiery tropical love.
The boy, he is 15, and probably very developed in mind, since his body has been circumscribed in action. Did he give you no explanation of these assaults?
No, he declared there was no reason. Never in the world could there be so devoted a son. My life is his life. He is absorbed in what I say or do.
Once again Holmes made a note. For some time he sat lost in thought.
No doubt you and the boy were great comrades before this second marriage. Were the strange attacks upon the baby and the assaults upon your son at the same period?
In the first case it was so. In the second case it was only Jack who suffered.
That certainly complicates matters. One forms provisional theories and waits for time or fuller knowledge to explode them. I fear that your old friend here has given an exaggerated view of my scientific methods. However, you may expect to find us at Victoria at 2 o'clock.
It was evening of a dull, foggy November day when, having left our bags at the Shickwar's, Lamberley, we drove through the Sussex clay. We finally reached the isolated and ancient farm-house in which Ferguson dwelt. It was a large, straggling building, very old in the center, very new at the wings, with towering Tudor chimneys and a lichen-spotted, high-pitched roof of Horsham slabs. The doorsteps were worn into curves, and the ancient tiles which lined the porch were marked with the rebus of a cheese and a man. Within, the ceilings were corrugated with heavy oaken beams, and the uneven floors sagged into sharp curves. An odor of age pervaded the crumbling building. There was one very large central room, into which Ferguson led us. Here, in a huge old-fashioned fireplace, there blazed and spluttered a splendid log fire. The room was a singular mixture of dates and places. The walls were ornamented by a fine collection of South American utensils and weapons. Holmes rose, with that quick curiosity which sprang from his eager mind, and examined them with some care. He returned with his eyes full of thought.
"Hullo!"
he cried.
"Hullo!"
A spaniel had lain in a basket in the corner. It came slowly forward towards its master, walking with difficulty. Its hind legs moved irregularly and its tail was on the ground. It licked Ferguson's hand.
"What is it, Mr. Ferguson? The dog. What's the matter with it?"
A sort of paralysis. Spinal meningitis, the vet thought.
Did it come on suddenly?
In a single night.
How long ago?
It may have been 4 months ago.
Very remarkable, very suggestive.
What do you see in it, Mr. Holmes? It is life and death to me.
I fear that there is pain for you, Mr. Ferguson, whatever the solution may be. I hope I may have something definite before I leave.
Please God, you may. If you will excuse me, gentlemen, I will go up to my wife's room and see if there has been any change.
When our host returned, he brought with him a tall, slim, brown-faced girl.
The tea is ready, Dolores. See that your mistress has everything she can wish.
She vera ill.
Cried the girl.
She no ask for food. She vera ill. I frightened stay alone with her without doctor.
Would your mistress see Dr. Watson?
I take him, I no ask leave. She needs doctor.
Then I'll come with you at once.
I followed the girl up the staircase and down an ancient corridor. At the end was an iron, clamped and massive door. The girl drew a key from her pocket, and the heavy oaken planks creaked upon their old hinges. I passed in and she swiftly followed, fastening the door behind her. On the bed a woman was lying who was clearly in a high fever. She raised a pair of frightened but beautiful eyes and glared at me in apprehension. Seeing a stranger, she appeared to be relieved, and sank back with a sigh upon the pillow. I stepped up to her with a few reassuring words. She lay still while I took her pulse and temperature. Both were high, and yet my impression was that the condition was rather that of mental and nervous excitement.
She lie like that one day, 2 day. I afraid she die,
said the girl. The woman turned her flushed and handsome face towards me.
Where is my husband?
Is below, and would wish to see you.
I will not see him.
Then she seemed to wander off into delirium.
A fiend! Oh, what shall I do with this devil?
Can I help you in any way?
No, no one can help it is finished. Do what I will, all is destroyed.
Madame, your husband loves you dearly. He is deeply grieved at this happening.
Again she turned on me those glorious eyes.
He loves me, yes. But do I not love him? Do I not love him even to sacrifice myself rather than break his dear heart? And yet he could think of me, he could speak of me so.
He is full of grief, but he cannot understand.
No, he cannot understand, but he should trust. I will not see him. Tell him only one thing, I want my child. I have a right to my child.
She turned her face to the wall. I returned to the room downstairs, where Ferguson and Holmes still sat by the fire. Ferguson listened moodily to my account.
How can I send her the child? How do I know what strange impulse might come upon her? How can I ever forget how she rose from beside it with its blood upon her lips? The child is safe with Mrs. Mason, and there he must remain.
A smart maid had brought in some tea. As she was serving it, the door opened and a youth entered the room. He was a remarkable lad, pale-faced and fair-haired, with excitable light blue eyes which blazed into a sudden flame of emotion and joy as they rested upon his father.
"Daddy,"
he cried,
"I did not know that you were due yet. I should have been here to meet you."
"Oh, I am so glad to see you."
He rushed forward and threw his arms round his neck with the abandon of a loving girl. Ferguson gently disengaged himself.
Dear old chap,
said he, patting the flaxen head.
I came early because my friends Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson have been persuaded to come down.
Is that Mr. Holmes, the detective?
The youth looked at us with a very penetrating and, as it seemed to me, unfriendly gaze.
What about your other child, Mr. Ferguson? Might we make the acquaintance of the baby?
Ask Miss Mason to bring baby down,
said Ferguson. The boy went off with a curious, shambling gait. My surgical eyes saw that he was suffering from a weak spine. Presently he returned, and behind him came a tall, gaunt woman bearing a child. It was a very beautiful child, dark-eyed, golden-haired, a wonderful mixture of the Saxon and the Latin. Ferguson was evidently devoted to it, for he took it into his arms and fondled it most tenderly.
Fancy anyone having the heart to hurt him,
he muttered, as he glanced down at the small, angry red pucker upon the cherub throat. It was at this moment that I saw a most singular intentness in Holmes's expression. His face was as set as if it had been carved out of old ivory. His eyes were now fixed with eager curiosity upon something at the other side of the room. Following his gaze, I could only guess he was looking at the window. A shutter had half closed outside and obstructed the view, but nonetheless it was certainly at the window that Holmes was fixing his attention. Then he smiled, and his eyes came back to the baby. On its chubby neck there was this small puckered mark. Holmes examined it with care.
Goodbye, little man. You have made a strange start in life. Nurse, I should wish to have a word with you in private.
He took her aside and spoke earnestly. I only heard the last words.
Your anxiety will soon, I hope, be set at rest.
The woman, who seemed to be a sour, silent kind of creature, withdrew with the child.
What is Mrs. Mason like?
A heart of gold and devoted to the child.
Do you like her, Jack?
Holmes turned suddenly upon the boy. Jack's expressive mobile face shadowed over and he shook his head.
Jackie has very strong likes and dislikes,
said Ferguson, putting his arm round the boy.
Luckily I am one of his likes.
The boy cooed and nestled his head upon his father's breast. Ferguson gently disengaged him.
Run away, little Jack,
said he. He watched his son with loving eyes until he disappeared.
Now, Mr. Holmes, I really feel that I have brought you on a fool's errand.
I have not been struck up to now with its complexity. It has been a case for intellectual deduction. I had, in fact, reached it before we left Baker Street, and the rest has merely been observation and confirmation.
For heaven's sake, Holmes,
he said,
if you can see the truth in this matter, do not keep me in suspense. How do I stand? What shall I do?
Certainly I owe you an explanation. But you will permit me to handle the matter in my own way? Is the lady capable of seeing us, Watson?
She is ill, but she is quite rational.
Very good. It is only in her presence that we can clear the matter up. Let us go up to her.
She will not see me,
cried Cut.
Oh yes, she will,
said Holmes. He scribbled a few lines upon a sheet of paper.
You at least have the entree, Watson. Will you have the goodness to give the lady this note?
I ascended again and handed the note to Dolores, who cautiously opened the door. A minute later I heard a cry from within, a cry in which joy and surprise seemed to be blended. Dolores looked out.
She will see them. She will listen.
At my summons Ferguson and Holmes came up. As we entered the room, Ferguson took a step or two towards his wife. She had raised herself in the bed, but she held out her hand to repulse him. He sank into an armchair. Holmes seated himself beside him after bowing to the lady, who looked at him with wide-eyed amazement.
I think we can dispense with Dolores,
said.
Oh, very well, madame. If you would rather she stayed, I can see no objection. Now, Mr. Ferguson, I am a busy man. The swiftest surgery is the least painful. Your wife is a very good, a very loving, and a very ill-used woman.
Ferguson sat up with a cry of joy.
Prove that, Mr. Holmes, and I am your debtor forever.
I will do so, but in doing so I must wound you deeply in another direction. Everything on earth is insignificant compared to that. The idea of a vampire was to me absurd. And yet your observation was precise. You had seen the lady rise from beside the child's cot with the blood upon her lips. Did it occur to you that a bleeding wound may be sucked for some other purpose than to draw the blood from it? Was there not a queen in English history who sucked such a wound to draw poison from it? Poison! A South American household. My instinct felt the presence of those weapons upon the wall before my eyes ever saw them. When I saw that little empty quiver beside the small bird, it was just what I expected to see. If the child were pricked with one of those arrows dipped in curare or some other devilish drug, it would mean death if the venom were not sucked out. And the dog, if one were to use such a poison, would one not try it first? I understood him, and he fitted into my reconstruction. Now do you understand? Your wife feared such an attack. She saw it made and saved the child's life. And yet she shrank from telling you all the truth, for she knew how you loved the boy and feared lest it break your heart.
Jackie!
Ferguson cried in a voice of shock and horror.
I watched him as you fondled the child just now. His face was clearly reflected in the glass of the window. I saw such jealousy, such cruel hatred as I have seldom seen in a human face. It is the more painful because it is a distorted love, a maniacal exaggerated love for you which has prompted his action. His very soul is consumed with hatred for this splendid child, whose health and beauty are a contrast to his own weakness.
It is incredible,
Ferguson gasped, trembling all over.
Have I spoken the truth, madame?
The lady was sobbing, with her face buried in the pillows. Now she turned to her husband.
How could I tell you, Bob? I felt the blow it would be to you. It was better that I should wait, and that it should come from some other lips than mine. When this gentleman, who seems to have powers of magic, wrote that he knew all, I was glad.
Ferguson was standing by the bed, choking, his hands outstretched and quivering.
I think a year at sea would be my prescription for Master Jackie,
said Holmes, rising from his chair.
Only one thing is still clouded, madam. How did you dare to leave the child these last 2 days?
I had told Miss Mason she knew.
So I imagined. This, I fancy, is the time for our exit, Watson,
said Holmes in a whisper.
If you will take one elbow of the two faithful Dolores, I will take the other,
he added as he closed the door behind him.
I think we may leave them to settle the rest among themselves.
I have only one further note of this case. It is the letter which Holmes wrote in final answer to that with which the narrative begins. It ran thus: Dear Nov 21st Vampires.
SIR. Referring to your letter of the 19th, I beg to state that I have looked into the inquiry of your client, Mr. Robert Ferguson of Ferguson and Muirhead, tea brokers of Mincing Lane, and that the matter has been brought to a satisfactory conclusion. With thanks for your recommendation, I am, sir, faithfully yours, Sar A. L. M. S.